Good morning. I'm going to move myself out of the way. Welcome to lesson 4, and we're looking at types of business organisations. Now, there's quite a lot in this, so you might want to chunk up the video or rewind me. And a wee reminder as well before we get started that there are some notes in the classroom, and I've linked to them on the bookshelf of my wee virtual classroom with my wee Bitmoji. And there's some links to the BBC Bitesize, and in there there's 2 really good videos as well that I'll point you to, and I'll leave a comment in the classroom so you can see them. So when we talk about types of organisations, we're talking about any organisation that exists to provide a good or a service to meet a need or a want. People think that just means businesses, but if you look at this chart here, you can see that it means anybody really that employs people to provide a good or a service. So a school is a type of organisation, and we're in the public sector because although we don't make a profit and although we don't sell you anything, we are providing a service. We are trying to provide a high quality education. And that service looks very different just now while we're working from home. So, if we take the private sector to begin with, there are, for the purposes of Act 5 business, 4 different categories of private sector organisation. We have a sole trader, that's a one person owned business, a partnership, which for most businesses means between 2 and 20 owners, and they can all have equal share ownership, or some people can own more of the business than others. We say between 2 and 20 for most businesses because there's a couple of examples, like a lawyer who could have more than 20 partners, but for the most part, it's between 2 and 20. Then we have private and public limited companies. So these are businesses that are owned by people who buy shares in the business. If you ever watch the news, you might see at the end they talk about the share price went up today or the share price went down, or at the moment you'll see the share price is at an all-time low because of everything that's happening with COVID-19. So if you are a business, a private limited company, then you're selling your shares to your family and friends, and you're inviting people that you know to buy a little part of your business. If you are a public limited company, then you are inviting anybody in the world to buy your shares. And that's the difference between the private and the public. But both limited companies sell shares in their business to make increased money. So not to make money, but to get more money in to allow them to do other things to develop their business. Now, I'm going to flag as well here, and we like to do this in business, we're using the words private and public limited company, but they're both in the private sector because they both, private and public limited companies, want to make a profit. They want to maximise their profits. Not to be confused with the word public, which is also used in the public sector. And the public sector in the middle there is any organisation that is funded by the local or national government and aims to provide a service. So schools and hospitals and the fire brigade and the NHS are all great examples of public sector organisations. And then the third type of organisation is the voluntary sector. So that's charities, social enterprises, and you did a wee task on that last week. So businesses that exist that are set up like private sector organisations, but they don't actually make a profit. They reinvest the money that they make back into their business. And then non-profit organisations like Stirling Voluntary Enterprise, Creative Stirling, these are organisations that exist in the voluntary sector. So if we move on, I'm going to tell you a little story. And this story starts with Bill. And Bill had been working for a large building and construction company for 20 years. One morning, he woke up and decided that he wanted to start his own construction business called Bill's Builds. And because Bill is on his own, he has started a new business as a sole trader. So Bill is an example of a sole trader because he is on his own. He is the only owner of the business. Now, he could employ people, but that still makes him a sole trader because he owns the business on his own. So Bill has started a sole trader, and I'm going to ask you in the classroom task to list the advantages and disadvantages of this type of business. So the advantages for Bill of opening up a business on his own, and the disadvantages of opening on his own. And you might want to pause the video now and then have a go at that task, because I'm going to give you the answers on the next slide. Okay, I'm moving on and I'm trusting you. If you have not yet completed that task, it's okay to look at this slide and get a little bit of help, but please don't just copy and paste the words that are on this slide into your answer, because I already know and you know that that's going to be right. What I'd like you to do is use your own words, because that tells me that you know what you're doing and you're not just really good at copying off a screen. So, as a wee reminder, then, a sole trader is a business who is owned and controlled by one person. Let's see how many of these advantages that you got. So, a sole trader is relatively easy and cheap to set up. In the exam, you wouldn't get a mark just for saying that it's easy to set up or it's cheap to set up. You'd have to compare it to other organisations. So we say it's relatively easy because compared to, say, a private limited company or a public limited company, they're much more difficult to set up because there's a lot more paperwork involved. With a sole trader, the owner makes all of the decisions. So Bill is 100% responsible for making the decisions of his business. He doesn't have to ask anybody else. That means he doesn't waste any time making decisions, and that means he doesn't have any arguments with everybody. And because he's the only uh, owner of the business, he gets to keep all of the profits. Now, a profit is the money that the business makes after it's paid out its expenses. So remember, Bill could have employees and he'd have to pay their wages, he'd have to pay taxes, he'd have to pay for insurance, he'd have to pay for rent on his business, he'd have to buy motor cars. There's loads of expenses he'd have, but if there's any money left over at the end of the month, it's Bill's because he gets to keep all of those profits. The disadvantages, because he's on his own, it is harder for loans from the bank because the banks might see him as a risk, especially because he's only starting out on his own. Yes, he's got 20 years' experience building business and as part of the construction industry, but that doesn't mean necessarily that he's going to be a good business owner. He also has unlimited liability. Now, you're going to hear this phrase a lot. Unlimited liability means that there is no limit to the amount of money that Bill could lose if his business fails. So, for example, if Bill has put in £5,000 of his own money and his business fails, he would lose that money. If his business fails and he has debts of £10,000, he would have to find the other 5,000 to recover those debts. So he may have to sell his house or his car or other things that he personally owns. So he is personally liable for any business that doesn't work out. There's also really long working hours with few holidays. Lots of people think that business owners have the life of luxury because they get to make all the decisions. They do, but they've also got to work really, really hard for that. And especially in the first few years, maybe he can't afford to employ as many people as he would like because he's not got an awful lot of money or not a lot of startup capital. So he may have to work long hours. He might not have all the information he needs to make all the decisions. So maybe that's not a good thing that he gets to make all the decisions because he then has sole responsibility for those decisions. Not everybody is brilliant at everything. He might be a really creative person, but he might not be very good with numbers or money. So if he has to make decisions based on how much to spend and he's got nobody to have a conversation with about do you think this is a good idea or not, then that could be a bad thing or a negative or a disadvantage. And because he's responsible for so much, he can't take any holidays, or if he falls ill even for a short time, then that might have a negative impact on the business. So there's loads of disadvantages as well of being a sole trader. Bill's business is booming. He's been run off his feet for weeks. The phone is constantly ringing. His customers love him. He keeps getting new customers, and the emails are pouring in. Bill's problem now is he can't cope with all this extra demand. He can't do it on his own. He knows there's more money to be made, but there's only him. So he has decided, excuse me, to get his wife involved. Jean is an accountant. She works as an accountant, and Bill thinks that Jean would partner for him in the business to cover the office work. So they rename the business Building Up, and Bill and Jean work together. What type of business is building up? So can you remember what we said was a business type that is between 2 and 20 people? Yes, it's a partnership. Well done if you said partnership. So again, we're going to ask you in the classroom to list the advantages and disadvantages of becoming a partner. And again, I'd ask you to pause the video and have a go at that on your own because the answers are coming up. I'm assuming you paused and you're starting again, so let's go. So, a partnership is a business owned between 2 and 20 people. Advantages. The workload can be shared. So, in this example, Jean is really good with the figures, Bill is really good with the construction, and the two, when they come together, can do more than one of them on their own. So, partners can specialise in different areas, and you're no longer relying on just one person having all the information. More money can be invested in the business because you would sometimes ask a new partner who's joining your business to bring some capital into the business. There are some disadvantages though. You still have unlimited liability, so a partnership is still liable for any of the debts that the business has if the business should fail. You may argue with your partner, you may not always agree on the right course of action or decision that's got to be made. You have to share the profits. So, unlike with a sole trader, where the one person gets to keep all the profits, in a partnership, the profits will be shared. And the other disadvantage is the partner may leave in the future. That's their right. They may want to take their money back out of the business, and that money might not be available, or you're back to the problem that you had before, where you don't have that shared expertise. I'm going to pause and just go back here to unlimited liability because this is a phrase that we see quite a lot. So the definition here of unlimited liability means that the business owner or partners are personally responsible for any debt the business occurs. This means that the owner's personal assets and belongings can be sold off to pay for the debt of the business. So if a partnership or a sole trader was to fail, you would not just lose the money that you've invested into the business, but you would also potentially lose your personal possessions. So your house, your cat, your car, any money that you've got in your own personal bank account could be used to recover the debts of the business. So unlimited liability. There is no limit to the amount of money that you're liable for should your business fail. Building Up is still doing very well and they decide to expand. Jean suggests that they bring in 2 new partners. Some reasons for bringing in new partners? Perhaps you're going to increase the skill set even further. Maybe your business has ran out of new ideas from the partners that are already there. Or again, the idea that businesses can bring more finance or capital in. And we're avoiding deliberately here saying bringing in more money. We're talking about bringing in more capital or more finance. Remember, for those of you, or all of you who have looked at the second presentation, we will look at the factors of production. Capital is one of the 4 factors of production. Investing new money into a business. So, Jean's pal, below the apostrophe there, Sue, is an interior designer. Jean thinks it would be a great idea to expand into the interior design market. Bill has a pal as well, Tom, who's an architect. Not sexist at all, this presentation. Bill thinks it would be a great idea to expand into the custom housing market. Financially, the business was doing well. However, there was big trouble in the boardroom with the 4 partners. Workload was getting heavier and more complicated. The partners were constantly disagreeing and falling out about the different direction of the business and the decisions that they were making. One day, Sue had had enough. She was overworked, undervalued, and stressed out her nut. "Rah!" said Sue in a very unprofessional business way. After a fight with Jean, and we mean an argument, there was no fisticuffs, the brick was not used, Sue left. Bill and Tom were in tears. Disturbed with the internal conflict of the business, Tom then left the partnership. What problems will Tom and Sue leaving cause for Building Up? Sue was still raging about the fight. She decided to start her own company to compete with Building Up. Ooh. Her husband was a joiner by trade, and her son had just finished his apprenticeship as a painter and decorator, just to keep the gender balance going here. That was convenient. They decided to set up a new business, a private limited company. So, when we take the idea of unlimited liability, meaning there is no limit to the amount of capital or money that the business could lose if they become in trouble, limited companies don't have that problem. They have limited liability, and that's the main difference. So private limited companies have limited liability. If these businesses were to fail, you only lose the money that is invested and tied up into the business, not your personal possessions. So a private limited company, first of all, is a company whose shares are owned privately. So you can only sell your shares in your business to people that you already know. So the shares are not available to the public on the stock market. Whereas a public limited company is a company whose shares are available for purchase on the public stock market. And anybody, you and I, could go on, if we had a little bit of money, and buy a share in a public limited company. A private limited company has a minimum of one shareholder. So if we think back to the definition of a sole trader being a business owned by one person, a sole trader could decide to become a private limited company. It's more complicated to set up a private limited company. There are more rules around the accounts that you have to do and some documents that you have to sign. But remember the big difference, you become limited in your liability. You're not going to lose everything. A public limited company must have a minimum of 2 shareholders before they can go public. Limited companies, both private and public, are owned by the shareholders, owned by the people who own shares in the business. They are controlled by a board of directors, so people appoint the board. And that's because you could have, even in a private limited company, hundreds of people having shares in that business. And you can't have hundreds of people all making decisions. So you appoint a board of directors, and it's the board of directors that are responsible for making the decisions within the business. And they must produce a memorandum and articles of association. So they're legally binding documents that set up the rules of the company. They're not overly complicated and they're not overly expensive, but you can see that that is a little bit more difficult than setting up a sole trader or a partnership. Advantages to private limited company. So because the shares are sold to people that you know, you cannot lose control of the company to strangers or to people outside. You can raise more finance than you can with a sole trader or partnership because you're inviting other people to join your business to raise capital for your business by selling shares to them. And the board of directors bring significant experience to aid decision making. So if you appoint new people to the board, they may have skills that you don't have. And crucially, you have limited liability. So should your private limited company fail, then you're not going to lose your cat, your house, or your car. You can tell a private limited company because it has the letters LTD after their name. And when you're out on your lockdown walk, you might see some private limited companies, shop fronts or vans driving around. Disadvantages of private limited companies. Again, because you're inviting more people to have ownership of your business, then the profits must be shared amongst those people too. Shares can't be sold to the general public, so that's a disadvantage if you want to grow. If you've ran out of friends or family who have money that they want to invest in your business, you have to, there's a limit to how much shares you can sell, and you must abide by the Companies Act. So again, this is some legislation, government legislation, that has certain rules for these types of companies. And a wee reminder that a business whose shares are owned privately by shareholders is the definition of a private limited company. We're going to pause the video at this point. I'm going to ask you to create a one-slide PowerPoint or Google slideshow or a mind map or a diagram or a Canva, you decide, showing the structure below and then some advantages and disadvantages of each of the organisations within the private sector. And then we'll catch up for lesson 5.